Electricity is just something most of us pay for once a month without giving a second thought. But imagine it could take over your whole life. That's what drew me to a flexible tariff, where the price of electricity varies every 30 minutes. Most of the time it's cheaper than the regular rate, but there are peak times where it can be a lot more expensive. So the price changes every 30 minutes, but you're given the rates for tomorrow in advance so that you can prepare for it. Now, if this sounds like too much work for you, clearly a flexible tariff isn't for you. I, however, like saving money. Not that I'm overly anal about my money. I do the usual stuff, like buying stuff in shops when it's discounted at the end of the day. I reuse my shower water to flush the toilet. I refuse to turn on the heating in winter, and I do bulk out my food with grass, just because it's sensible to do those things. So you can see I'm sensible with money, but I'm not ridiculously over the top about it. I even took a sponsorship from Instant Gaming for this video. Instant Gaming isn't just another online marketplace. It lets you buy games from authorized resellers from a range of different platforms. All the way from PlayStation to PC. Once you've picked your platform, it is easy to browse down the deals or to sort by whatever's trending at the time, or for which digital distribution platform you want to buy a key for. Down at the bottom of the page, you can sort by category, which is great if, like me, you enjoy doing everything alone and without friends in single-player titles. There's actually not a lot more to say about Instant Gaming than that. It's simple, straightforward, instant, has what you want for decent prices, and has a totally great Trustpilot score too. So, if you fancy potentially saving yourself some money on a new video game purchase, and you want to support my content at the same time, then check out my sponsorship link in this video's description, see what Instant Gaming has to offer, and go and have fun. You can even pre-order games at a discount before they're out, allowing you to save even more money than I managed to in my elaborate, flexible electric rate adventure. Spoiler alert. So yeah, check out the link in this video's description. So I saw a flexible electricity tariff as a way to potentially save some money, because just so you know, 24 pence per kilowatt hour is the normal rate to pay for electricity in England. That's what most people pay. But a flexible tariff can fluctuate, rising up to as high as 35 or even 40 pence per kilowatt hour during peak times, which I intend to avoid, and then at night it can drop down far below the average rate, down to just a couple of pence per kilowatt hour. Sometimes it can even go to negative amounts in the early hours of the morning. So I thought, so long as you avoid peak times, you can easily game the system, and the only cost to it is any added inconvenience it adds to your lifestyle. But me, my lifestyle's already upside down. I don't mind working through the night and sleeping through the day, so obviously my eyes lit up at all the potential savings. I was looking at many pennies saved every day, possibly even £1 or £2. All I had to do was simply sleep through the day and work through the night. So I gave it a go, starting in December 2024. Which was a big mistake, because after a year of very cheap electricity, England was immediately hit with a power crisis. Being the middle of winter, solar was non-existent. An unprecedented storm meant that wind turbines actually had to switch off to protect themselves, and all nuclear power plants caught wind of my switch to a flexible tariff, so all went down for maintenance, and it meant that during peak times, the price per kilowatt hour spiked to 99.999999 pence, which is the current cap of the flexible pricing scheme. So it was a bit disheartening to excitedly join the flexible tariff only to immediately see everybody on the forums for it outraged about these ridiculous spikes. These were people who had claimed that although they'd saved money every day that year, that was all now being wiped out by these few very costly days. And they didn't think it was fair. Well, I was fresh to the fight, so I doubled down. I was going to see if I could save money, even under worst case conditions such as these. Those first few days were exciting, with me charging all my batteries up in the middle of the night and then strictly shutting my PC down and switching to battery-powered devices the moment the electricity prices shot above normal. At times when the electricity hit £1 per kilowatt hour, I felt like I was under siege, huddled up in bed in the dark, gaming on my Steam Deck at minimum brightness. I felt truly alive. Some days were so expensive that I literally hibernated throughout the entire day and only poked my head out at night. Like I said, it was pretty exciting. And it's not all about saving money. A lot of this was just to see if I could beat a system that seemed rigged against me. And it really educated me on the power consumption of stuff and quickly ingrained simple rules like to wait until late in the evening before using the washing machine or playing demanding games on my PC. Obviously, having a 600-watt RTX 5090 made all this quite difficult for me. But you can still limit this by power limiting it to about 400 watts, and then in game you cap the frame rates and use extreme upscaling settings to hit those frame rates as efficiently as possible. Under the correct conditions, the RTX 5090 can actually be one of the most efficient graphics cards to use. And those are just the downsides of the flexible scheme. There are also positives, because after about 11 at night, the prices would finally drop down to below average, sometimes even hitting negative numbers in the early hours of the morning. Now, it's not like anything magical happens the moment the cost per kilowatt hour drops below zero. It is a sliding scale after all, but psychologically, something big happens. Because think about that for a second. It means I could turn on my electric heater, not just for free, but I would actually be paid to use it. I could actually make money by using electricity at certain times in the day. Even when on a standard fixed electricity tariff, something in my mind was always counting the pennies whenever an electric heater was on. But if electricity is negative in cost, obviously I'd uncap my frame rates in game, unpower limit my processor and graphics card, and whack on the electric heating. And all these things would suddenly become money printing machines. I effectively had to rewrite my brain for these new electricity tariff rules. On the surface, all this seems counterintuitive. These systems are here to encourage you to be more green and careful with how you use electricity. So for it to be encouraging me to whack on an electric heater at night even when it's not needed, sounds like it isn't working as intended. But all this is about the bigger picture. By disincentivizing electricity usage during peak times, and by rewarding middle-of-the-night electricity binges, it's about flattening out the demands on the country's power grid. Electricity is always being made, it's just that during peak times when everybody switches their ovens and kettles on, more is required, so power plants have to spin up, and these tend to be from non-green sources like gas. Whereas at night, wind turbines are still turning and producing electricity, and if anything it helps the grid for someone to consume that electricity, especially if it gets a heavy electricity user like, an RTX 5090 user, to switch to using it at night instead of in the day. That is how it can still be green to encourage excessive electricity usage, but at quiet times. And so, at the end of December, despite an electricity shortage and the harshest electricity pricing spikes in recent history, on the flexible tariff I ended up saving a whopping £7.64. And all I had to do was to give up seeing daylight for that month. But if December had been a baptism of fire, January was even worse. It's like the wedding of fire or something. The start of 2025 no longer saw the same insane 99.99999 pence kilowatt spikes, which is good. But instead, something far more insidious occurred, because while the electricity prices never spiked quite so high, they never actually dropped far below average either, not even during the cheapest times of the day, like at 4 in the morning. It would still remain in excess of 20 pence per kilowatt hour. And for somebody trying to save money, this was brutal. It meant that even if I switched everything off at the right times and hibernated throughout the most expensive parts of the day, and carefully switched between mains and battery power, all it would take would be for my fridge to power up for a few minutes at the wrong time of the day, and I'd end up paying more for that day than somebody else who's just on a fixed tariff enjoying excessive electricity emissions whenever they like, even at peak times like the early evenings. No fair. In fact, for one day in January, I paid 50% more because I was on a flexible tariff. And I wasn't even in the country that day. What gives? And it meant that, despite doing absolutely everything I could to keep my electricity costs down, for the first 3 weeks in January, I paid £8.05 more for my electricity than I would have done on a normal, easy, flat rate scheme. Almost 2 months into this flexible tariff, and I was now worse off, despite also having borne the immense burden of a very inconvenient lifestyle. And I'm sorry to say that at that point I had had enough and I switched back to fixed again. Because sure, I like a challenge, provided it's possible to win. But this simply wasn't. But things may be changing this year. Because your kilowatt hour rate is only half the equation. The other is a fixed cost that you pay simply for being connected to the electricity grid. Think of it as an electricity subscription. Now, the standing charge used to be less than 20 pence a day, but in recent years taxpayers have needed to pay substantially more to ensure that the privately owned electricity companies can continue to make record profits, and thus it's made up a large percentage of the total cost that we all pay for electricity. And this does impact my behaviour. I have this cute little mini PC that only consumes about 30 watts of power, and I would love a good reason to use it, like a financial one. But when the savings from using this thing are so insanely offset by the fixed daily fee that I pay simply for being connected to the grid, I'm like, screw it, I'll just use something more powerful instead. And I hate that. I've grown up believing that you turn things off when you're not using them, that you switch lights off as you leave the room. In fact, I sometimes turn it off as I enter a room. I keep windows closed to keep the heat in, and I switch stuff off at the mains rather than leaving it on standby. I don't think any of this makes me a cheapskate or a green energy nut. It just seems sensible to do. Efficient, tidy. I know that a few pence incentive shouldn't be enough to change my behaviour, but it really is. But I'm not stupid. I know that as long as there isn't a financial incentive to use electricity in a different way, then most consumers won't bother, and corporations certainly won't. It lies with the government to incentivise the behaviour that aligns with a shift towards greener energy usage, and a small financial incentive can go a very long way. Just look at one-use plastic bags. Well, you can't because they don't really exist anymore. When they were free to use in supermarkets, people did use them freely to bag their stuff, because doing so was the easiest and laziest path of least resistance. But all it took was the threat of charging 5 pence per bag, and people totally changed their behaviour. They started bringing their own bags, or they bought reusable ones instead, or found other ways of transporting their stuff back home again. Me? I was ahead of the curve. I've been the cool kid with a rucksack for ages. Not because I cared about the environment, it's just that I liked having my hands free, and I hated the way that plastic bags dug into them as I was walking. But 5 pence per plastic bag was all it took to shape everybody else's behaviour, and you should have seen the resistance that charge faced, and again when it was raised to a whopping 10 pence per bag. But now nobody even thinks about it because their behaviour has already been shaped, and the greener alternative has become second nature. So the reason for implementing flexible tariffs may be for the government to hit its emissions targets or whatever, but as the end user, it doesn't really matter if you care about being green or not. If there's a financial incentive to do so, you will follow it. Just look at how bitter I was about the opposite being true, having lost a staggering 42 pence from using a flexible rate tariff during the most costly time of the year for that kind of scheme. So that was my foray into flexible electricity tariffs. But to put it simply, it isn't just flexible, it's been gamified. Something that used to be just a boring old price that I had to pay has now been made into a game, a challenge, something that I feel I now have more control over and more incentive to do something about. I've long believed that the education system would be made a lot more efficient and enjoyable if they somehow turned maths, English and science into video games that we could play, and the exams into bosses. But until then, it's great to see the energy sector implementing such a scheme and proving to me that it is a good idea after all. I may be off the flexible tariff again right now, but my heart is not. And I'm eyeing up the prices regularly. They're dropping, and once they drop enough and the game becomes winnable again, I'll no doubt switch back to it. And if I'm honest, the prospect of doing that makes me kind of excited. But then I am someone who enjoyed eating grass.